Welcome back, Wanderers. It's Naidra. In today's video, I'm going to show you guys my most up-to-date evade build that I have designed specifically for doing speed farming like Hell Tides, Undercity, Citadel. You can even take this into the pit. As of right now, I have tested it against a pit level 100. I designed this again more for speed farming, so I'm not trying to take this into pit level 150. If you're looking for something that's going to be able to handle pit level 150, be sure to check out my video on the Quill Volley build I released last week. But with that, this build, like I said, is going to be really great for speed farming and getting endgame content completed pretty quickly. That being said, I will take you guys into a pit level 100 just to show you guys how this works. I'm sure a lot of you guys are already familiar with the evade build that was being used at the beginning of the season. This is going to be very similar to that, but I'm still going to show you guys how it works. And then as usual, we'll dive into our equipment, skill tree. We'll take a look at the Paragon board and all of that other good stuff as well. Before we dive into the pit, if you guys have not yet subscribed, please don't forget to do so below. That would really help me out so I can continue to make videos like this and also to support the channel as well. All right, let's go ahead and dive into a pit level 100. Perfect. So we've jumped inside the pit. Before we get started, so this is one of the most simple builds to use. Super easy. Anybody can do this. Even if you're a new player to Diablo, this will be super easy to do. For the most part, in basically all of the content that you can run into, all you need to do is evade. However, for those that are taking it a little bit further, and if you are wanting to go into higher levels of pit at 100 or higher, you're going to need to do a little bit more than just evade. And what I mean by that is we will need to activate our defensives. We will need to activate our Scourge, counterattack, Ravager, and also our Armored Hide. And then, of course, the Hunter will help us out with doing damage as well. But in most cases, you're probably not going to have to use that because your enemies should be dying from across the screen before you even get there, especially like I mentioned, if you're doing outer world content like Hell Tides or things like that. So let's go ahead and take a look and see how this works. Right now, I've got 8 evades, which makes it a little bit easier and we don't have to worry about it recovering. So we're just going to start evading away as we go towards the enemies. And like I mentioned, this is a pit level 100, so some of these monsters do have a little bit more HP, but when we run into monsters that can take more damage, we will start activating our defensives, and then you'll see they'll be able to die pretty quickly. And so at this point, all I'm doing is just hitting my evade button, and that's pretty much it. And then like I said, once we've grouped these guys up, or if we're running into somebody that is an elite monster, we'll hit Hunter and then activate our defensives, and that should eliminate them pretty quickly. So with that being said, you should be able to complete a pit level 100 in about 3 minutes or so with a build like this, depending on the layout that you get. Pretty easy to do, especially if you're running the solo. And then the bosses are also pretty easy to take down as well, so you're not going to run into too much trouble at the end of the pit clearing it out. And we're not relying on the shatter effect to take down our enemies, although we are using the Felled Soothsayer aspect with this build. We're not necessarily relying on it to make sure that we're able to take down our enemies at the end of the pit. So with that being said, you guys see how this build works. Most of the monsters that we hit, if we're close enough, should be able to take them down within just one hit pretty quickly. And then, like I said, activate defensives when we're going up against enemies that are a little bit more powerful or have a little bit more HP. Okay, so with that being said, let's go back to town and take a look and see what we're looking at in terms of our gear and our skills. Alrighty, so starting off with our gear, for the first time in the season, we are not using the Rod of Kepaliki. We also will not be using any type of a unique weapon. But for this guy, we are going to be using a polearm. It is going to give us that 114% extra vulnerable damage, which will be useful. And then we are going to be using the redirected force aspect with this. When we look at our stats, we're specifically looking for dex, maximum life, and we want as much crit strike damage as possible. A majority of our damage that we're putting out is coming from our critical strike damage, so it is important that we have that. If you can get a GA on this guy, definitely want to go for crit strike damage. And then, of course, if you can get a second one, maximum life will be helpful as well. With that, we are tempering on the primary Eagle Spirit Hall potency. And then we're also going to temper on the Stormfeather potency. And when we look at our masterworking, we want to try to get all 3 into primary Eagle Spirit Hall potency. for the first time this season as well, I finally was able to get all 3 masterworks exactly where I wanted them for this specific item. So again, if you can, try to get all 3 of those onto primary eagle spirit hall potency. For our runes for this guy, we are using Bach and Jaw. Jaw is going to allow us to teleport, so allowing us to move a little bit faster as we're going through this endgame content. We can add other runes to this to give us a little bit more attack damage or attack power, but because of the type of content that this is designed for, we really don't necessarily need more damage. We want a little bit more mobility, so Jaw is going to be perfect for this. I have also tried using the vortex with this guy as well, which is helpful. While the evade damage does automatically target its enemies most of the time, you don't necessarily need them grouped. However, we are casting fear on these guys sometimes, and having them spread out like that makes it a little bit more difficult to clear them as quickly. So if you are running into that issue, feel free to throw on the vortex rune. However, in most cases, you shouldn't have that problem as the enemies will be dying pretty quickly. Taking a look at our boots, we are using the apprehension aspect for this guy. We do want to make sure that we specifically have the +3 to maximum evade charges for this guy. We want to have as many maximum evades as possible. If you don't hit a monster, your evade doesn't recover as quickly. So sometimes you may run into an issue where you don't have any evades left if you haven't hit a monster. So we want to make sure that we increase our maximum evade charges, and the perfect way to do that is by adding it onto our boots. For our stats, we want Dex, Maximum Life, and Armor on this guy. If you can get a GA, primarily focus on Maximum Life. It does help to have it on Dexterity as well, but the one we really want would be Maximum Life. Taking a look at our tempers, we want Evade cooldown reduction for this, and then we also want to increase our Scourge size as much as possible. So let's go ahead and throw those tempers on there. And then for our Masterwork, we want to try to Masterwork our Maximum Life as much as possible on the boots. Moving on to our pants, we are going to be using the menacing aspect for this one. We are going to take Dexterity, Maximum Life, and Armor for our stats, where we are going to temper on Barrier Generation and Maximum Resolve stacks. As per usual, Maximum Resolve stacks really help us out in several different ways. We're getting damage output from this, we're getting damage reduction from this, and we're also getting block chance from this as well. So we're triple dipping with having those Maximum Resolve stacks. When we look at masterworking it, we want to masterwork all 3 into Maximum Resolve if possible. That's going to be the difference between 9 and 12. So if you can, go for that. 9 is still going to be super helpful, but again, if you are better at masterworking than I am, go for all 3 on Maximum Resolve stacks. For our gloves, we can go a couple of different ways with this, but the one that I'm finding to be most effective right now is the Fist of Fate gloves. This is giving us attack speed, critical strike chance, and it's giving us lucky hit chance as well, with the possibility of dealing anywhere between 1% to 300% of normal damage to our enemies. So really helpful. If you don't have Fist of Fate, or if you don't want to use Fist of Fate, you can swap that out and use regular legendary gloves with the conceited aspect. I think that would probably be the best way to go, which will give you an additional up to 30% damage. And you also then could temper on a couple of additional things, like some additional Mystic Circle potency. You could also increase the Scourge size with this as well if you'd like to. So a couple of different ways we can go if you decide to use different gloves. But as of right now, the most effective one is the Fist of Fate. When we look at masterworking this, we want to try to masterwork critical strike chance, all 3 if possible. Again, another one of those that I got super lucky with, and it's about time because I've had no luck with masterworking this season. But we want as much critical strike chance as possible because we are tapping into the critical strike damage, and that's where a majority of our damage output is coming from. Having that critical strike chance as high as possible is going to make sure that we're getting the highest amount of damage output altogether. Looking at our armor, we are using the Shroud of False Death as usual. For this guy, we want to masterwork all 3 into maximum life. And then for our helmet, for the first time this season, we are using Harlequin Crest. So instead of using a regular one, we are going to be using a mythic. This is really helpful specifically because we're getting a high amount of cooldown reduction. That means that we get to evade as much as possible, but also too, that means that our defensives are going to be coming back more frequently. The more we can have our defensives on, the more damage output we're doing as well. And not to mention, of course, it's giving us some of that tankiness as well, but specifically we're using this for that damage output altogether. Now, when you look at masterworking, you want to try to masterwork all 3 if possible into cooldown reduction. For me, I was only able to get 2, which brought me up to 49%, which is great. However, the more cooldown reduction we have, the better this build is going to be. And then for the runes, I am using Sem and Gar for this guy. You probably won't see too many people using the Gar rune, which is super easy to get. But like I mentioned, we want to try to get our critical strike chance as high as possible. And because we are evading very frequently, that means we're getting an additional 25% critical strike chance all the time from having this specific rune in there. Taking a look at our amulet, we are using the interdiction aspect for this guy. This is the first time we're also not using the Banished Lord's Talisman with a build for this season. For the stats, we're looking for dexterity, maximum life, and we want total armor. While this is going significantly over the armor cap, it is contributing to our total damage output. Ideally, we want to try to have about 5,000 armor with this build if possible, but 4,700 is going to work out. As far as our tempers go, we are going to be tempering on barrier generation, and once again, we're going to be tempering on maximum resolve stacks, where our masterwork should all be going into maximum resolve stacks if possible. Looking at our rings, we are using the unyielding hits aspect for the first ring. For the stats, we're going to be taking dexterity, maximum life, and critical strike chance. And then we're going to temper on Stormfeather potency and defensive cooldown reduction on this guy, where we're going to want to masterwork our Stormfeather potency 3 times if possible. If not, we'll take 2, and then the other one can go on to crit strike chance. And then lastly, for our equipment, we do have the Fell Soothsayer aspect, as I mentioned earlier. The Fell Soothsayer aspect is too good to not take, and specifically because it is double dipping, where we are able to make our enemies vulnerable by having this aspect, specifically when we're using Armored Hide. This is an incarnate skill, which means our enemies are going to be vulnerable, and we are tapping into some vulnerable damage as well. So super helpful. The second part of this is if our enemies are grouped up, it does also have that shatter effect, and the shatter effect really is most useful when we're tackling higher level difficulties or higher level pits. Because our enemies have so much life, that means they're taking a lot more damage, so when they explode, they're also dealing more damage, which is super helpful. And then for our tempers, we're taking Stormfeather potency for this guy as well, and then we're going to take defensive cooldown reduction also, and then masterworking all 3 if possible into Stormfeather potency. When we look at our gems, we are using skulls in our amulet and our rings to increase our overall armor. And then for our chest armor and pants, we are going to be using amethyst. Taking a look at our skills, we're going to be putting 5 points into Thunder Spike. We're going to take that up to Enhanced Thunder Spike and finish it up with Accelerated Thunder Spike. We are not going to be taking any core skills, so we'll go ahead and skip past that and make our way down to our focus skills, where we will be taking 3 points into Mirage, and then moving that up to Unrestrained Power for 3 points as well. We're also going to be taking 1 point into Ravager, taking it down to Enhanced Ravager, and then finishing it up with Replenishing Ravager. On the left-hand side, we're going to take 1 point into Focal Point, and then 3 points into Apex. Moving on down to our defensive skills, we will be taking 1 point into Endurance as usual, and 3 points into Perseverance. We will then be taking 5 points into Armored Hide, taking it up to Enhanced Armored Hide, and then finishing it up with Reinforced Armored Hide. We also will be taking 1 point into Counterattack, taking it down to Counterattack Enhancement, and then finishing it up with Reinforced Counterattack. Next, we will take 1 point into Scourge. We will take that down to Enhanced Scourge, and then wrap it up with Adaptable Scourge. On the right hand side, we're going to be taking 2 points into Patient Guard. You don't have to put 2 points into this. However, we do have a couple of points to spare. So if you'd like to allocate this somewhere else, you're more than welcome to. However, I find that this is probably going to be the most useful. And then we'll take that up to Auspicious with 3 points into that. And then lastly, for our defensive skills, we will be taking 2 points into Anti-Venom. This is going to give us some poison resistance and max poison resistance, which should be helpful. But really, we only need 1 point into this. So like I mentioned, if there's somewhere else you'd prefer to allocate the 2 points from Anti-Venom and an additional point from Patient Guard, you're more than welcome to. But I believe this is what's going to be the most helpful for this build right now. Taking it down to our potency skills, we are taking 3 points into Resilient. We will be taking 3 points into Brilliance, And then this time we will be taking 3 points into acceleration, which does give us some additional evade charges. And this also gives us additional damage as well. So really helpful to have 3 points into this guy here. And then lastly, before we move on to the next part of the skill tree, we will put 3 points into potent. And then jumping on down to our ultimate skills, we're going to be taking 3 points into resolution, moving it up to spiritual attunement for 1 point. We just need this point so that we can move on over to supremacy, where we're going to add an additional 3 points. And then for our actual ultimate skill, we will be taking hunter for 5 points, moving it down to harmonious hunter, and then lastly, exalted hunter. With that being said, that leaves us with 1 point. So we'll move down to our key passives, where we are going to be taking adaptive stances. Now, taking a look at our Paragon board, this will look slightly different than what we're used to seeing. So our first glyph is going to be the Talon glyph instead of Spirit. And keep in mind, if you're not quite at the level that I'm at right now, which is 280 for Paragon, you don't necessarily need to fill out all of these dex nodes. You just need enough to activate the glyph itself. But you can circle back and add these additional dex nodes once you've completed all 5 Paragon boards and have additional points to spare. Moving on up to the second board, it's going to be Viscous Shield, and we're going to pair this up with the Jagged Plume glyph. And then jumping over into our third board, we're going to be taking the Convergence node and pair that up with the Spirit glyph. And then moving down to our fourth board, we have the Drive node, which we're going to pair up with the Fulminate glyph, which gives us additional lightning damage. And because this skill, like Quill Volley, does do lightning damage, we will see some significant enhanced lightning damage coming out of this. And then finally, we will finish it up with our fifth board, which is going to be the Sapping board. And we will pair that up with the Colossal glyph. Now, keeping in mind, the Colossal glyph just needs 25 strength. You do not need to go beyond that 25. We just need to activate the glyph itself. Since this is not going to be a gorilla skill or a gorilla build, we are not going to benefit from the additional gorilla damage, but we do significantly benefit from having that additional 2% times increased damage for each resolve stack that we have. And ideally, we should have around 20 plus resolve stacks so that we can maximize on the damage output. Now, once you've completed all these boards, like I mentioned, we're going to circle back to the initial board that we have, which will give us increased lightning damage and eagle damage. And then we'll make our way over to the Spirit glyph, which will give us enhanced critical strike damage and add as many dex points around this as possible. And then taking a look at our Spirit Hall, we are going to be using the Eagle for the primary spirit and Gorilla for our secondary spirit. And then lastly, taking a look at our Mercenaries, we have made a slight change to this. So we will be using Subo for our Mercenary, and we're going to be utilizing the Wire Trap skill, moving that down to Ready at Hand. And then we will be taking Cover Fire and wrapping it up with Opening Fire for that 25% times increased critical strike damage to enemies hit by Subo's Cover Fire. And then for our reinforcement, we are going to be taking Rahir, who's going to be using Shield Charge, and this will trigger every time we cast our ultimate skill, the Hunter. With that being said, that's all I have for you guys for today. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, if you haven't yet subscribed, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. That would greatly help me and also help support the channel. If you guys would like to see any other builds that I have not yet done, please also don't forget to comment that below. Other than that, thank you for joining me, and until next time, Wanderers.